Say On Her Majesty's Secret Service and your average person might respond with something like, "Oh, the one-time Bond," or "Was that the one without Connery?" And for many years that's how this film was regarded. A curio, a failed experiment, sneered at by critics and written off as some kind of mistake. However, time has shifted our perspective somewhat, and this film has now become something of a gold standard for Bond fans and film critics alike. I've always liked On Her Majesty's Secret Service, even before it was popular, so this video won't be a blow-by-blow account of the film's production. It's about my experience of it and what I took from it. As a kid, you'd hear bits and pieces about the Bond films, fragments of conversation after my parents came home from seeing the new ones, my brother and friends occasionally referencing them in conversation. And of course, kids' TV shows from the 1970s like Screen Test on the BBC and Clapperboard on ITV. The James Bond films were the genesis of what we now call the action genre, and some of their content definitely tested the boundaries of what the censor would allow. Much of the cheeky innuendo would go over the heads of young children, but the violence was quite uncompromising. Indeed, 1963's From Russia with Love had featured probably the most brutal fight scene ever committed to film at that time. Even today it stands out as a proper no-holds-barred fight to the death. So my parents were naturally cautious about when to let me start seeing these films.
You won't be needing this, old man.
From 1967 until his retirement in 1995, my father worked for the UK charity Scope, running a residential centre in southwestern Cornwall for people with severe cerebral palsy. Gladys Holman House sat in 7 acres of beautiful grounds, so we had all that space to play in. My brother would stage football matches with his pals, while I'd be running about with some cap gun or the other playing cops and robbers with mine. We'd moved to Cambourne from a rather grim town in Lancashire where Dad's job had been fraught with difficulty and the local schools were rough. So when we came to this brand spanking new house in Cornwall, it was like riding a lift out of purgatory and into paradise. In the 60s and 70s there were no video recorders or DVDs, and disabled access to public places could be very tricky. That meant the best way for our residents to visit the cinema was if the cinema came to them. So Dad got hold of a 16mm projector and ordered some film catalogues. In the new workshops we installed a 20-foot sheet of heavy-duty white canvas, weighted by a length of 2x2 and rolled up when not in use. The sound system was a couple of mono speakers at the front, but it worked and you could hear everything clearly. Usually, when you rented a movie, you'd have it for a week or so, which meant that we could also fit in private screenings at home. Sometime in 1972, my grandparents were staying, and as we'd got Thunderball, out came the projection equipment. By this time I was 9, so after many months of nagging by me, my parents decided I was old enough to see my first Bond film. It made quite an impression. I didn't fully understand the plot, but I knew who the goodies and baddies were, and I thought it was terrific. 2 years later I got to see another one. This time we had family over from Canada, and we all sat down to watch On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Dad would often thread the projector up before dinner and then leave it ready for later, but whilst doing so he'd often sit puffing his pipe and watch the first few minutes. Thus it was, whilst the smells of imminent dinner wafted upstairs, I got to hear John Barry's title music for this film for the first time. I can remember standing there watching the brilliantly realised titles showing time slipping away and Bond's past adventures inside an hourglass, hearing that theme and thinking, this is incredible! It was my introduction to one of the most innovative and daring James Bond films, and probably John Barry's finest Bond score. More about the music later. Originally, the producers had intended to make On Her Majesty's Secret Service after Goldfinger, but a settlement for the rights to Thunderball had recently been reached, so they made that one instead. After Thunderball, On Her Majesty's Secret Service was postponed again because of a mild winter in Switzerland and not enough snow for the skiing scenes. Eventually, You Only Live Twice was chosen. This meant On Her Majesty's Secret Service would arrive in a different order to that of the literary canon. But Saltzman and Broccoli weren't worried. They'd secured a new face for the lead role and confidently offered George Lazenby an unheard-of 7-picture deal. As this film is over half a century old, I'm going to assume that most people who want to see it have done so. But just for the sake of completeness, here's a summary of the story. It's very early in the morning and Bond is heading along a coastal road after an all-nighter at the casino. He spots a young woman about to attempt suicide and rescues her. This woman is Teresa or Tracy and is the daughter of Marc-Ange Draco, head of a large European crime consortium. Draco wants to repay Bond for saving Tracy and offers him £1 million in gold if he will marry her. Bond declines and instead asks Draco where he can find Ernst Stavro Blofeld, the head of Spectre. Draco gives Bond a lead conditional on Bond continuing to see Tracy. Bond's lead is reluctantly sanctioned by M, so posing as a herald from the College of Arms, Bond visits a strange allergy clinic located on top of the Schildhorn in Switzerland. Blofeld's adjutant and chaperone at the clinic is Fraulein Irma Bunt, a character described in the novel as a squat, toad-like woman. The would-be Count is working on individual cures for a group of young women, many of them from farming families and all with debilitating allergies. In reality, Blofeld is using post-hypnotic suggestion to condition his patients to return home and poison crops and livestock with an extinction serum. Bond's cover gets blown, and whilst trying to flee his pursuers, he runs into Tracy, who has followed him to Switzerland. They get away, but a blizzard forces them to spend the night in a barn. There, Bond proposes marriage to Tracy, and she accepts. Blofeld and his goons show up the next morning, but Bond and Tracy are already on skis and heading downhill. Blofeld triggers an avalanche and, thinking he's killed Bond, finds an unconscious Tracy and takes her captive. He then makes his demands to the United Nations. He wants an amnesty for his past crimes as head of Spectre and recognition of his title when he retires into private life. The UN feels it has no choice but to give Blofeld what he wants. Not about to let it drop, Bond launches an unsanctioned mission with Draco to rescue Tracy and destroy Blofeld and his virus. Pete's Gloria is successfully destroyed while Bond chases after Blofeld. A fight on a bobsled ends with Blofeld fracturing his neck and Bond presuming him dead. Bond and Tracy get married and have just left for their honeymoon when Blofeld and Bunt drive past. They unload an M16 into Bond's car, missing him, but killing Tracy. A James Bond film with a downbeat ending. Although readers of the novels would have come across this in both From Russia with Love, where Bond is seemingly killed, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, it was another matter entirely for the film to stick with the ending as written. In fact, had George Lazenby not announced his departure whilst still filming, the plan was to have Bond and Tracy ride off into the sunset at the end of Majesty's, and then have her get shot at the start of Diamonds Are Forever. With Lazenby still in the saddle as Bond, this would have made Diamonds into a superb revenge thriller, rather than the gloomy disappointment we ended up with.
One of us smells like a tart's handkerchief.
On Her Majesty's Secret Service was slated as the story to introduce a new Bond, and inevitably that meant some new creative choices. This included sticking very closely to Fleming's original story. Then there was the matter of casting the lead. Some 400 actors were considered for the role, but by a mixture of minor subterfuge, brass neck and sheer blind luck, the winner would be George Lazenby. In the end, it came down to a fight scene audition. Forgetting to pull a punch, Lazenby accidentally belted a stuntman, breaking his nose. That settled it. He had both the charm and the edge to be the new Bond. But it was to be the director of the film, Peter Hunt, who would take George Lazenby, the man from the Fry's chocolate advert, and make him into the new Bond. Right after he was chosen, Lazenby admitted to Hunt that he'd never really done any acting. Hunt laughed and said that, having just convinced two of the most ruthless movie men into signing him as Bond, he hadn't got much to worry about. In the canon of the novels on Her Majesty's Secret Service is the middle part of what's sometimes called the Blofeld trilogy or the Spectre trilogy. These are Thunderball, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and You Only Live Twice. In Thunderball, Spectre, led by Blofeld, steals 2 nuclear bombs and threatens the West with devastation unless a huge ransom is paid. In On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Blofeld tries to blackmail the UN for amnesty as described earlier. And then finally, in You Only Live Twice, Bond, having completely lost his edge following Tracy's murder, ends up in Japan where he tracks down Blofeld and strangles him to death. However, the films reversed the order of the last 2 stories, and whilst You Only Live Twice went off the deep end of fantastical escapism, On Her Majesty's Secret Service brought the series back to reality, with Bond relying more on his fists than on convenient gadgets. This trait of escalation into silliness followed by a plummet back to relative sanity would happen time and again as the Bond franchise wore on. Bond in space, followed by Bond in Greece.
Not that low.
Bond in an invisible car, followed by Bond wishing he was invisible. The cinematic world of Bond had a good bit more glamour than the novels. Fleming would lure his reader in by taking just enough reality and then embellishing it with a lattice work of invented detail, and thus readers would be drawn to suspend disbelief and go along with the story. To bring 007 to the screen, the filmmakers created a world that was both lavish and outlandish, with preposterous plotting but just enough real-world flourishes to do on celluloid what Fleming had done in print. In a way, the Bond films were a perfect storm of creativity. There was no template for spy films until Bond came along. But the producers wanted to make sure every dollar was up there on the big screen for all to see.
Merry Christmas, 007. I'm Sir Hilary Bragg.
Crazy villains, terrifying dangers, wildly imaginative sets, music you couldn't forget, and a hero who somehow always escaped. And it wasn't just James Bond who escaped. For a couple of hours, so could audiences. It was a winning formula. Eventually, aged 14, I knew the ropes well enough to take over from Dad as projectionist. By the time I was in my mid-late teens, I was also selecting the films that we showed. One year, I let my fondness for Bond films run a bit wild and chose 4 of them in a programme of 10 films. I think my father pruned that list a little bit before it was finalised. Scriptwriting duties for On Her Majesty's Secret Service were passed to Bond regular Richard Maybaum. The story went through some 10 drafts, but the result was a superb script with a few touches of erudition added by Simon Raven. Donald Pleasance didn't return as Blofeld because director Peter Hunt wanted someone who could pose a real physical threat to Bond. Thus, Telly Savalas was cast.
Those ancestors of yours are very hard work.
And the College of Arms is being very well paid.
Well, if you put it like that.
I do put it like that.
For Blofeld's sidekick, Irma Bunt, the producers went with German actress Ilse Steppert. This was a great piece of casting. Steppert was very popular in Germany, but much less well known elsewhere.
You're very good heads, my dears.
Cheers.
It has been so nice to cure you.
Done up to look rather less than motherly, she perfectly conveyed the toad-like aspects of the Fleming character. Finding the right location for Blofeld's lair was tricky, but the filmmakers discovered a new alpine restaurant and club nearing completion atop the Schilthorn. A deal was worked out whereby the production would help complete the premises and build a helipad. Everything worked out so well that the resort kept the name Piz Gloria after the production. The production itself posed plenty of technical and logistical challenges. For one thing, at 10,000 feet, the thinner air would push the stunt team to its limits, and medication was needed to help the cast and crew acclimatise. Special power generators were also needed, and the revolving restaurant required orange acetate window filters to make the interior daylight just right for filming. Ken Adam was busy on Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, so production design duties for this film were handled by Sid Kane. He was a great choice for the movie, as the direction this time was much more towards realism and the budget was smaller. The volcano in You Only Live Twice had cost $1 million on its own, so this time Broccoli and Saltzman were quite happy to rein it in a bit. At the time, and for many years afterwards, the received wisdom was that Lazenby was dire, and the film would have been better with Connery.
Carte.
I don't agree. Sean Connery was so fed up with Bond he wasn't even on speaking terms with the producers when shooting You Only Live Twice. And it shows. He just looks bored and detached throughout that movie.
There's nothing here but volcanoes.
To have goaded him back to do this one could have resulted in a real clunker of a film. The script needed a slightly younger, more earnest Bond, and Lazenby actually carries that off rather well. Had he stayed on, I'm pretty sure he'd have found his audience. It didn't help that the tabloid press already had their knives out. Stories abounded about friction between George Lazenby and Diana Rigg. The truth, of course, lay somewhere in the ravine between fact and myth. Alas, Lazenby had also been advised that Bond was passé and that the social revolution of that time was the right wave to ride. Desperate to retain his leading man, Harry Saltzman drew Lazenby on one side and pushed a suitcase across the desk with $1 million in cash. But Lazenby declined and walked away from the role. Aged 11, I was blithely unaware of all this as I watched this amazing snowbound adventure. I sat transfixed watching the ski chases, the close shaves, the battles with Spectre and the tragic ending, and was totally unaware of the film's 2-hour and 20-minute runtime. And then there was that music score. John Barry had crafted the sound of James Bond over 5 previous films, and with this one he was so on the money I'd nominate it as the best of all the 11 Bonds he did. 8 other composers have scored Bond films, but so strong are the musical traditions established by John Barry that anyone else writing for the franchise has to honour them, or it just doesn't sound like Bond.
Darling, you're in trouble. What is it?
There's people out there.
With Lazenby gone, the filmmakers were left in the unenviable position of having to sell a new James Bond as hard as they could, knowing full well that he would immediately be yesterday's man. Thus Peter Hunt leaned heavily on his composer and asked Barry to produce his best ever James Bond score. John Barry responded by creating a whole new sound for the film. Gone was the twangy electric guitar of the James Bond theme, and in came a completely new instrument, the Moog synthesizer. On a Majesty's Secret Service was among the first half-dozen film scores to use a Moog, and it came across brilliantly. But rather than let it take over, Barry blends just enough of its unusual sounds with the orchestra to create what one commentator described as a commando assault of a theme. The opening 4 chords of the piece are intriguing. Played slowly, they feel almost like they don't belong together. But cut loose, they set the scene for an edgy, dangerous world of intrigue and violence, where success isn't guaranteed and death is just one snowy precipice away. But these chords aren't just there to start the main theme. They crop up in several different places in the score, including in this beach scene before the titles even play. John Barry is laying the foundation for his main theme when it finally does explode onto the screen. There's another dimension to the sound of this particular score, as its moody and unsettling harmonic shifts brilliantly foreshadow the tragedy to come. Because the title didn't lend itself to lyrics, Barry wrote a love song for the growing romance between Bond and Tracy. He used the words that run right through both novel and film. We have all the time in the world, and he made them the key idea. The emotion and the tragedy this song evokes are both reused quite shamelessly in 2022's No Time to Die.
Can you go faster?
We don't need to go faster. We have all the time in the world.
Along with various other visual cues and musical gems from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I was in two minds about this when I saw it. On the one hand, there's no denying it works, but it also felt like sentiments hard-earned by one film were being appropriated and then parachuted into another. Before I bought any genuine Bond soundtracks, I had listened to some covers by the Jeff Love Orchestra. They weren't bad, but I could hear how they differed from the actual arrangements, and that set me off looking. I didn't realize it at the time, but I must have already been able to recognize the difference between crowd-pleasing re-recordings and the keener edge of on-screen arrangements. For me, collecting film music started with James Bond, and from there I went on to discover other composers. From Bond and John Barry, I branched out into Ron Goodwin, Elmer Bernstein, Maurice Jarre, John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith, amongst others. Being projectionist at the centre just heaped dry wood on the fire, and I quickly had quite a stack of film LPs. Up until maybe the late 1990s, it was common practice for film scores to be re-recordings, usually by the original composers, but with the music presented as an LP-length program. Often the tracks, or cues as they're known, were adapted so you'd get a nice selection of music, but it just wasn't the same as you'd heard in the cinema. And for someone like me who noticed these things, it was really disappointing. Eventually, the expanded format of CDs and then streaming created a niche market for film score fans who wanted to hear everything as originally conceived and laid down. Bit by bit, old titles were dusted off, remastered and extended. It took a few years for the landscape to change, but nowadays most movie scores tend to feature the majority of what's been composed.
Now, Mr. Bond, you must learn to be absolutely calm before we can accept you back into polite society.
There's an awful lot more I could say about On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but for me it was a distinct point in my musical awakening. I was lucky enough to see the film in a very early version of what's now recognised as home cinema. That immersive viewing experience stuck with me and gave me a deep appreciation of the rare and delicate art of film scoring.